The loud music and colorful party lights reflected off the smiling faces, but no glare was more intense than the cold sweat that ran down my back as I stared at the entrance to the ballroom. She was there, next to him, laughing as if the world couldn't fall apart at any moment. And I knew I could. I knew I was about to fall apart. Every word of that call still echoed in my mind like a bell hammering in my chest. "Let's go to the party together, baby." I froze when I first heard this. I was left breathless, floorless. I thought of thousands of explanations, I tried to believe in coincidences and misunderstandings, but there, before my eyes, there was no more room for doubt. They were together. And the worst? They didn't even bother to hide it. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it drowning out the music. I walked towards them not knowing exactly what I would do when I got there. I just knew I needed to act, I needed to stop that lie, rip their mask apart, even if it destroyed me in the process. And when the words left my mouth, they cut the air like a knife. I discovered everything. You will be unmasked. Her eyes widened, and the hand holding the champagne glass shook. He, on the other hand, kept that damn smug smile, like he was above it all, like nothing could touch him. It was at that moment that I realized that this was not just a betrayal. It was more than that. It was a carefully planned humiliation, and I had just entered the main stage of this cruel play. She tried to get closer, reaching out her hand as if she could erase what had been done with a simple touch. "It's not what you think. Please let me explain." But his voice shook more than his words, and I knew that explanations would be nothing more than lame excuses. I took a step back, and the void that opened between us seemed greater than any physical distance. He, next to her, let out a short, mocking laugh, and looked at me as if I were insignificant. "You are exposing yourself here. You are humiliating yourself." Anger burned inside me, but I took a deep breath, maintaining my posture. I wouldn't be taken down by them. The surrounding crowd was starting to notice what was happening. Murmurs arose, glances were turned, but no one dared to approach. It was as if everyone was watching an accident waiting to happen, unable to look away. I could feel the judgment in the air, the whispers cutting like invisible blades. But that didn't matter. Nothing else mattered other than exposing them. "Do you think you can fool me? Do you think you can get away with this? You will see what it is like to pay for every lie." My voice echoed, and silence took over the environment. She tried to speak, but I interrupted her. "He arrives. I heard everything. I saw everything. And now everyone will know too." Her gaze went from shock to despair, and I saw the exact moment she realized she had lost control of the situation. He, however, took a step forward, as if he wanted to intimidate me, as if physical proximity could silence me. "You don't want to do that here. Let's talk somewhere else." But I laughed. A short, bitter laugh that reverberated in the hall. "To talk? Like you? After what you did? No, I'm not leaving. You're the ones who should get out of here right now. Or rather, I think everyone needs to know who you really are." The crowd was starting to move. People took out cell phones, recorded videos, sent messages. Both of their faces began to change as they realized there was no longer any way to control the narrative. The power had slipped from their hands and was now in mine. I could see the fear growing in her eyes, the tears threatening to fall, but something inside me no longer cared. As I spoke, laying out the details I had gathered, the connections I had made over the past few weeks, the lies I had uncovered, and the suspicious schedules that finally made sense, I felt a strange satisfaction. It was as if, for a brief moment, I was taking back a piece of myself, a piece they had tried to steal. But along with this satisfaction came an uncomfortable question: how far was I willing to go? I could feel the crowd's eyes switching between me and them. Some shocked, others curious, and some visibly pleased to witness the fall of a seemingly perfect couple. But there was something more to that moment, something I still didn't fully understand. Something that was about to turn everything upside down. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, barely audible, but charged with raw emotion that made me freeze. "I made a mistake, but it's not what you think. There's something you don't know." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue, but she hesitated, looking at her lover as if seeking approval or courage. And that's when I knew. They were hiding something bigger. Something that could change everything. The silence that followed was heavier than any words spoken that night. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and in that moment I realized that, as painful as the betrayal was, there was something more. Something I hadn't yet discovered, but was about to be revealed. And when it was, nothing would be the same. Welcome to the channel where the truth behind the masks is mercilessly exposed. Here, we do not support and will never justify any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they carry a real and powerful message. Betrayal destroys lives, breaks hearts and leaves deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and raw emotions. This is more than a story, it's a warning about the devastating consequences of the wrong choices. Sit back, and be ready to hear a story that will move you. The living room of Eric and Laura's house was bathed in soft light, which reflected off the neutral-toned walls and shelves organized with small picture frames. Photographs marked important moments: the wedding, the trip to Italy, the birth of the son, birthdays and celebrations that, somehow, seemed immutable and eternal. For those who knew them, Eric and Laura were the picture of stability. A beautiful, successful and seemingly happy couple. He is a practical and analytical man, manager of a technology company. She is charismatic and detail-oriented, an administrative assistant at a large corporation. They were the type of couple that aroused admiration and, perhaps, a little envy in those who watched them from afar. But the intimacy of the home told another story, one that not even the pictures on the walls were able to reveal. Eric had always been a dedicated man. He arrived at work early, faced tight deadlines and knew how to deal with pressure without losing his cool. At home, he maintained the same posture. "I liked being in control, having clear plans and goals. I knew where I wanted to go and, until that moment, Laura was an inseparable part of that journey." He had met her at a corporate event years before, and the attraction had been instantaneous. Laura had that engaging way of speaking, as if the words were floating around her. It was beautiful, elegant and safe. Eric fell in love quickly and intensely. But time had shaped Laura in different ways. Although she remained attractive and confident, the lightness in her voice was beginning to sound forced. The smiles, once spontaneous, now seemed calculated. Small, almost imperceptible details that Eric refused to see clearly. Laura, on the other hand, had dreams that went beyond the walls of that house. "I loved the stability Eric provided, but I missed something I couldn't describe. Maybe emotion. Maybe adventure." In the first years of marriage, Laura felt satisfied, as if she were living the fairy tale she had always imagined. But over time, routine turned that tale into a predictable story. Eric had become so reliable that, paradoxically, he became too predictable. And no matter how much she tried to push these thoughts away, they came back with force on silent nights, when Eric was already asleep and she was staring at the ceiling, wondering if that emptiness she felt would ever disappear. That night, Eric arrived home later than usual. The company was preparing an important project, and he had been putting in extra hours to make sure everything was perfect. He found Laura in the kitchen, cutting fruit for dinner. She smiled, but her eyes didn't hide her tiredness. He came over, kissed her forehead and asked her how her day had been. Laura spoke superficially about work, mentioned a tiring meeting and commented on the invitation to the company party that would take place on Friday. Eric nodded distractedly as he grabbed a glass of water. He didn't notice the hesitation in her voice, nor the way she avoided looking at him directly. Over the next few days, Laura mentioned the party a few more times, but Eric was too busy to pay attention. He knew corporate events were common at his wife's job and trusted her enough not to question the details. After all, that was what made them a solid couple, trust. What he didn't know was that Laura had spent the last few months developing a closer friendship with a coworker. Someone who made her laugh during work, who praised her ideas and paid attention to the little details that Eric no longer noticed. But Laura, even carrying this secret connection, convinced herself that she was doing nothing wrong. It was just friendship. Something light, without consequences. On Friday, Eric arrived early to try and surprise her with a romantic dinner before the party. She stopped at the flower shop, bought red roses and even stopped by the wine store to pick up her favorite bottle. He was excited to see her, to make up for the last few days he had been emotionally absent. When he entered the house, however, he found Laura already ready to leave. She wore a tight, elegant black dress, different from what she usually wore for company events. His hair was perfectly done, and the perfume he wore was the same one he had bought for his wedding anniversary. For a moment, Eric felt disconnected from that image. It was as if he was looking at a stranger. She smiled when she saw him, but her smile seemed rushed. He said the party would start early and he couldn't be late. He tried to insist that they have dinner together beforehand, but Laura refused, saying that the company had reception plans right at the beginning of the event. Eric was silent as he watched her walk out the door, taking with her something he couldn't name. He felt a tightness in his chest, but he pushed the thought away. He was being paranoid, he thought. Laura has always been trustworthy. There was no reason to doubt her now. But the unrest persisted. While eating dinner alone, Eric tried to distract himself with the news on TV, but his mind kept returning to the image of her leaving the house. He took out his cell phone, opened the messaging app and almost typed a text asking if he had arrived safely. At the last moment, he gave up. I didn't want to seem insecure. However, the feeling that something was wrong grew by the minute. He then decided to take the car keys and drive to the party location. Just to make sure everything was okay. When he arrived, the parking lot was full. Luxury cars filled the spaces, and the lights of the hall shone through the large windows. He got out of the car and walked towards the entrance. The guests' heels echoed on the marble floor, and laughter and music escaped through the open doors. Eric stopped for a moment, took a deep breath and entered. His eyes scanned the room until he found her. And it was at that moment that he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. She was there, next to another man, talking animatedly and laughing like he hadn't seen in a long time. Eric stood there, motionless, as the seconds dragged by. Her every movement, every gesture seemed rehearsed, as if that scenario had already been carefully planned. And then, as if sensing his presence, she turned her face and saw him. The smile disappeared, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. It was at that moment that Eric knew, with piercing clarity, that that night would change everything. Eric remained standing at the entrance to the room, unable to take his eyes off Laura. She looked different. Not just because of the elegant dress or the carefully styled hair, but because of the sparkle in her eyes, that kind of sparkle that he hadn't seen in a long time and that now seemed to belong to someone else. The man next to her leaned in slightly, saying something that made her laugh. It was a light, unassuming laugh, but to Eric it sounded like a blade cutting through the air. He tried to take a deep breath, regain control before acting on impulse, but his heart was hammering in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He felt the sweat building up in his palms and the heat rising up his neck as he fought the urge to cross the room and snatch Laura away. She hadn't seen him yet, and Eric used those seconds to observe them. The closeness between the two was disconcerting. The way he touched her arm when he spoke, the way he leaned his body in close, ignoring the social distance normally expected between colleagues. Laura didn't back down. On the contrary, it seemed too comfortable, as if that interaction had been repeated before, as if there was enough intimacy for it not to be new. Eric swallowed, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth, and began to move towards them. With every step, his mind struggled to find explanations. Maybe it was just the man's manner, maybe Laura was being too polite, trying to avoid misunderstandings or office gossip. But then she looked up and saw him. For a moment, he froze. The smile disappeared, and her hands instinctively moved away from the man, as if she had been caught in the act. Eric felt his stomach drop. She knew. He knew what that looked like, knew what it meant, and the panic in his eyes was the confirmation he didn't want to have. He stopped just a few feet away, and the tension in the air was so thick it seemed palpable. Laura stepped forward, as if wanting to intercept him before he could say anything. The man next to her also turned around, but remained still, watching. Eric felt the need to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. When he finally managed, his voice sounded harsher than he intended. He asked what was going on, why she hadn't mentioned anything about going with someone. Laura tried to explain, saying it was nothing, that he was misinterpreting it. But his eyes betrayed his words. The man interrupted, saying that perhaps it would be better to talk away from prying eyes. Eric laughed, a short, dry laugh, without humor. There was no longer any way to keep it a secret. He pointed to the looks around and asked if they thought they could hide something there, in front of everyone. Laura begged him not to make a scene, but it was too late. The accumulated anger, the distrust suffocated in the last few days, everything exploded at that moment. He accused Laura of lying, of betraying his trust, and the man finally intervened, trying to calm the situation, but his presence only made things worse. Eric turned to him, asking who he thought he was to be involved in their lives. The man tried to remain calm, saying he was just a coworker and that it was all a misunderstanding. But Eric no longer listened. Every word seemed to only fuel the fire within him. Laura tried to hold his arm, asking him to get out of there, but he let go, staring at her. He asked directly, bluntly, if there was something going on between them. Her hesitation was all he needed to know the truth. Her silence was broken by a murmur from the crowd. People were clearly paying attention now, and Eric felt the weight of the stares, but he no longer cared. Laura tried to say that it wasn't what it seemed, but Eric cut her off, asking how long this had been happening. The man tried to intervene again, but Eric pushed him away, causing him to take a step back. Laura screamed for them to stop, but Eric couldn't stop himself. The security guards started to approach, and Laura finally managed to put herself between the two, asking Eric to leave with her. He pulled away, breathing deeply, trying to regain control. He looked at her one last time and, in that moment, he saw something he would never forget. It wasn't just guilt in her eyes. It was something deeper. A disguised fear, a concern that went beyond that situation. He realized there was something hidden, something she wasn't willing to tell. Eric left the room, but the bitter taste remained. Laura followed him, calling his name, but he kept walking until he reached the car. When he finally stopped, he turned to her and asked if there was anything else she wanted to say. Laura hesitated, opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Eric shook his head, feeling the weight of that moment crush him. He got in the car and left, leaving Laura standing in the parking lot, staring into space. As he drove, thoughts raced through his mind. The betrayal was clear, but there was something more. He felt it. Something that Laura didn't have the courage to admit. And at that moment, I knew I needed to find out. Because as much as the pain of betrayal consumed him, the feeling that there was something even more devastating hidden in those lies was what really haunted him. Laura was sitting on the sofa, her shaking hands clasping her knees. Eric remained standing, pacing back and forth like a cornered animal, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for answers she seemed incapable of giving. The silence between the two was piercing, filled with tension and unspoken words. The clock on the wall ticked away cruelly, each second ringing louder than the last. Eric finally stopped, staring at Laura with a look that mixed anger and pain. He demanded that she speak, that she tell the truth once and for all, because he could no longer stand this game. Laura slowly raised her head, her teary eyes meeting his, but instead of responding, she looked down again. Eric stepped forward, his voice shaking as he asked her if she thought he was stupid, if she really believed he hadn't realized something was wrong for weeks, maybe months. He leaned over her, demanding to know who the man was who was destroying their marriage. Laura stood up abruptly, making Eric step back for a moment. She looked him in the eyes, now with a mixture of fear and despair, and said that it wasn't as simple as it seemed, that it wasn't just about betrayal. Eric laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh, asking if she really thought she could smooth the situation over with that excuse. She asked him to listen to her, to give her a minute to explain. He crossed his arms and remained silent, but his eyes burned with expectation. Laura hesitated, took a deep breath and began to speak. She said that their relationship had been changing for years, that the love she felt for him never disappeared, but that she missed being seen, being desired, being someone other than the perfect wife. She confessed that she approached her coworker because he made her feel alive again, because he looked at her in a way that she hadn't seen in Eric's eyes for a long time. Eric interrupted, asking if that was an excuse to destroy everything they had built, if she really thought those words justified the humiliation he felt at that party. Laura began to cry, apologizing repeatedly, but Eric was unmoved. He wanted more, he wanted the full truth, and he said he knew there was still something she was hiding. She tried to deny it, but he insisted, saying that the fear in her eyes that night wasn't just because of the act, but because of something bigger. Laura shook her head, as if she wanted to deny it, but the words came out before she could stop herself. She confessed that the man he saw her with at the party was not just a colleague. Eric stood still, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet again, but Laura continued, revealing that this man was her boss and that they had been involved for longer than she wanted to admit. He felt his blood boil, but before he could explode, Laura said something that made him freeze. She said that her boss had a lot of power in the company, and that in recent months, she started receiving veiled threats. She said he used their relationship as a form of control, insinuating that if she broke it off he would lose his job and destroy his reputation. Eric approached slowly, asking if that was true or just another attempt to justify what she did. Laura cried even harder, begging him to believe, saying she felt trapped and scared. Eric took a step back, running his hands over his face as he tried to process everything. He asked her why she hadn't told him earlier, why she hadn't asked for help. Laura replied that she felt ashamed, that she was afraid that he wouldn't believe her, that he would judge her before understanding what was really happening. He said that, at first, he thought he could control the situation, but things quickly got out of control. Eric felt a mixture of anger and compassion. Part of him wanted to hug her, protect her, but another part couldn't forgive the betrayal, couldn't accept that she had allowed it to happen for so long. He asked if she was still in love with her boss, and Laura shook her head, saying no, that she never was, but that she felt dependent on what he offered, attention, validation, and then fear. Eric felt his stomach drop. He asked if she had slept with him, and Laura nodded, crying even more. She said it was a mistake, but after that he started to have something against her, to use the secret as a weapon. Eric remained silent, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. He wanted to scream, he wanted to destroy something, but all he could do was ask her why she didn't trust him. Laura replied that she didn't know how. Silence once again filled the environment, dense and suffocating. Eric walked away, sitting on the couch, feeling the weight of everything crushing him. Laura knelt in front of him, begging for a chance to make things right, saying she would do whatever it took to regain his trust. Eric looked at her but said nothing. His mind was racing, processing every word, every revelation, and the only thing he knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. As Laura continued speaking, Eric felt something shift inside him. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, but the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability she showed when confessing what she was going through, made him realize that the story wasn't over yet. He needed answers, he needed to understand how much this would still impact their lives. Laura held her hand, but Eric slowly pulled her away, saying he needed to think. He got up and left, leaving Laura crying on the living room floor, knowing that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Eric drove aimlessly for almost an hour, the radio off and the silence in the car filled only by the sound of the engine and his tumultuous thoughts. Laura's confession continued to echo in his mind like an open wound, pulsing every time he tried to take a deep breath. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, as if he could control the crushing pain building inside him. The image of her kneeling on the floor, asking for forgiveness, mixed with the memory of the man he saw next to her at the party, and the anger burned again, hot and suffocating. But along with the anger came doubt. Was what Laura had said really true? Was she being manipulated, or was this just another carefully crafted excuse? Without realizing it, Eric stopped the car in an empty parking lot, the dim streetlights illuminating the night palely. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts before picking up his cell phone and dialing Laura's number. When she answered, her voice was hoarse, still marked by crying. He said he wanted to find her, but away from home, away from the memories that seemed to make everything heavier. Laura hesitated for a second before agreeing. They arranged it in a small park that they used to visit in the first years of their marriage, before routine and commitments began to swallow up those moments of lightness. Laura was already there when Eric arrived. She was sitting on one of the benches near the fountain, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself from the cold, even though the night was warm. When he saw him, he got up quickly, but didn't come any closer. Eric stopped a few meters away, studying her as if it were the first time he had seen her. Something about her seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the weight of her choices had finally doubled her strength. He approached slowly and pointed to the bench, indicating for them to sit down. She began to speak first, as if afraid that the silence would take away her courage. She said she knew he was hurt, that she understood if he could never trust her again, but she needed to tell the rest of the story. She needed him to know what was really at stake. Eric interrupted her, saying he had heard enough, but Laura insisted. She said her boss wasn't just manipulative, he was dangerous. She said that, after the first time they were together, she tried to end everything, but he started threatening her, saying that he had proof of the affair, photos, messages, call records. He said that if she tried to walk away or tell anyone, he would destroy her reputation at work and make her lose everything. Eric shook his head, unable to contain his frustration. He asked her why she didn't go to the police, why she didn't ask for help. Laura replied that she was afraid, that she didn't know who to trust, and that, deep down, she also felt guilty. She admitted that, for a while, she liked the attention, she liked feeling desired, but that it quickly turned into a nightmare from which she didn't know how to escape. Eric stood up, pacing back and forth, fighting the mixture of anger and compassion that was beginning to form inside him. She said she didn't know if she could believe her, that it all seemed too convenient now that she'd been caught. Laura got up too, approaching him slowly, her hands shaking when they touched his arm. He said he had proof, that he had started saving messages and recordings of conversations in case he needed to defend himself. She said she was afraid that Eric would find out everything before she could get out of the situation, and that was why she kept the secret for so long. He moved his arm away, but something in her voice made him stop. He asked why she was only telling him that now, and Laura replied that she thought she could handle the situation alone, but after he caught her at the party, she realized that everything had gotten out of control. Eric was silent, trying to process what he was hearing. Part of him wanted to believe, wanted to hold on to the idea that Laura was trapped in something bigger than she could control. But another part couldn't forget the images of her smiling at another man, the closeness between the two, the obvious betrayal. He looked at her, eyes full of pain, and asked if she still loved him. Laura cried, saying that yes, she had always loved him, but that she had made a terrible mistake and was willing to pay for it, as long as she had the chance to make things right. Eric shook his head, saying he didn't know if he could get through it. He said he was tired, that he felt empty, and that he no longer knew who they were. Laura held his hands, begging him not to give up on them, to try to find a way. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and said he needed to see the evidence she mentioned. Laura nodded and took out her cell phone, showing messages and recordings. Eric heard the man's voice, the threatening, possessive tone, and felt his stomach drop. He asked why she had never told him anything before, and Laura replied that she didn't think he would believe it, that she was afraid he would just see her as a traitor. He looked at his cell phone, then at Laura, and felt the weight of that decision tighten his chest. He knew he couldn't just erase what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the real fear in her eyes. He said he needed time, that he needed to think, but he promised that he would do something to protect them both from that situation. Laura cried again, thanking him, but Eric remained distant, feeling that, even though he was willing to fight against that problem, something inside him had changed forever. They left the park together, but in silence. Eric drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the road, while Laura looked out the window, lost in her own thoughts. When they arrived home, he asked her to go and rest, saying he needed to organize his ideas. She hesitated, but obeyed, going up the stairs and leaving him alone in the room. Eric sat on the sofa, holding the cell phone with the recordings, and felt a chill down his spine as he thought about what he would have to face in the next few days. I knew that battle was just beginning and that the real confrontation was yet to come. Eric spent the night awake, sitting in the living room, staring into space while the clock on the wall ticked the hours. The house was silent, but his mind continued to spin, full of questions that couldn't be answered. The messages and recordings that Laura had shown were there, saved on her cell phone, as material proof that something much darker was behind everything that had happened. But, as much as that evidence explained part of the situation, it did not erase the pain of betrayal nor alleviate the weight of the humiliation he felt. Every word said by the man on the recordings echoed like a sentence, and the image of Laura next to him remained stuck in Eric's memory, like an open wound that refused to heal. The night was slowly advancing, and Eric got up to get a glass of water, but his hands shook as he held the glass. He felt exhausted, as if the weight of it all was draining his strength, but at the same time, he couldn't find rest. He thought of Laura upstairs, sleeping or perhaps crying, and the thought of going upstairs and confronting her again stopped him in his tracks. He wanted to believe that there was still something to be saved, he wanted to believe that the love they had built over the years could be enough to overcome this, but distrust infiltrated like a poison, making it impossible to see a future where they could be together without her. Shadow of that event. The cell phone vibrated on the table, bringing Eric back to reality. It was a message from Laura, asking if he was okay. He looked at the screen for a few seconds before responding with a simple, "I need to think." I knew those words would make Laura even more anxious, but I couldn't offer more than that at that moment. He needed time to understand what he felt, to decide if he was capable of forgiving her or if this would be their last night together in that house. Over the next few hours, Eric began thinking about his next steps. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. I needed to take action towards Laura's boss, I needed to ensure that he no longer had power over her or anyone else. But at the same time, I felt an internal conflict growing. Part of him wanted to act calmly, seek legal help, gather more evidence, and take the high road. But another part, more instinctive and driven by anger, wanted to face that man directly, confront him and make him pay for what he had done. As he struggled with these thoughts, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Laura appeared at the living room door, her face marked by tiredness and her eyes red from crying. She stopped at the threshold, hesitating for a moment before entering. Eric watched her in silence, his chest tightening at how vulnerable she looked. She approached slowly, as if afraid that any movement would push him further away. Laura sat next to him on the sofa, keeping a cautious distance. She said she knew he was still angry, that she didn't expect to be forgiven so soon, but that she needed to know what he was thinking. Eric was silent for a moment, trying to find the right words, but when he finally spoke, his voice sounded harsher than he intended. He said he didn't know what to think, that he was trying to decide if it was worth fighting for or if he had already lost everything. Laura lowered her head, but then looked at him again and said she would do anything to prove that they could still fix what had been broken. He asked if she really believed that or if she was just trying to hold on to something because she was afraid of losing the security they had built together. Laura denied it, saying that she loved him, that the fear of losing him was what was killing her more than anything else. She took his hands, begging him not to give up, but Eric pulled his hands back, saying words wouldn't be enough this time. Laura took a deep breath and said she was willing to report her boss, even though she knew it could cost her job and reputation. She said that she had already accepted the consequences, but that she needed to know if Eric would be by her side if she made that decision. He remained silent, thinking about the weight of that choice. He knew that if he stayed by her side, he would be committing himself to facing this whole storm together, but he also knew that if he turned his back now, he would never be able to forgive himself for not having at least tried. Finally, Eric said he would stay, but on one condition: she would need to be honest in every detail, without hiding anything. Laura immediately agreed, saying that she no longer had anything to hide. Eric took out his cell phone and started listening to the recordings again, analyzing every word in search of something that could be used as concrete evidence. As he did so, Laura watched silently, holding back tears. When they finished listening to everything, Eric decided they needed help. He called a friend who worked as a lawyer and set up a meeting for the next day. Laura seemed relieved, but Eric still felt a knot in his chest. He knew that this battle would not be easy, that exposing her boss could have unpredictable consequences. But, no matter how difficult it was, he was determined not to let that man continue to exercise power over their lives. They went up to the room together, but slept separately. Eric stayed in the armchair by the window, looking out at the street while Laura lay down on the bed, facing the opposite side. The physical distance between them reflected the emotional division that still hung in the air, and Eric wondered if that barrier would ever truly be broken. The next day, they went to the lawyer's office. Laura was visibly nervous, fidgeting with her hands the entire time they waited to be called. Eric remained silent, but he kept an eye on every movement around him, as if he expected something to go wrong at any moment. When they finally entered, they explained the situation in detail, handed over the recordings and showed the messages. The lawyer listened carefully, taking notes and asking specific questions about her relationship with her boss. He said there was a strong case of harassment and coercion, but warned that exposing the situation could trigger retaliation, both in the workplace and in their personal lives. Laura turned pale, but Eric shook her hand, saying they wouldn't back down. The lawyer promised to take the necessary measures and assured them that they would have protection, but asked them to be careful until everything was made official. As they left the office, Laura seemed more relieved, but Eric knew that this was just the first step in a long and painful process. As they walked to the car, he looked at her and asked if she was sure she was ready to face this. Laura nodded, saying that she could no longer live in fear and that, even if she lost everything, she wanted to regain his dignity and trust. Eric looked ahead, took a deep breath and started the car. He knew there was still a lot to be faced, but, for the first time in days, he felt that it might be possible to find a way out of this nightmare. The sun was already starting to set when Eric stopped the car in front of the building where it all started. Laura was at his side, with her hands shaking in her lap, staring at the entrance as if she expected that, at any moment, someone would come out to stop them. Eric turned off the engine but didn't move immediately. He felt the tension in the air and knew that this moment would be definitive for both of them. He turned to Laura and asked if she was sure what they were about to do. She looked at him with teary but determined eyes and said that there was no going back, that she needed to put an end to this, even if it cost everything that was left of her professional life. Eric nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. There was a weight in her words, as if she knew that this outcome would be accompanied by deep scars, some perhaps irreparable. They got out of the car and walked together to the entrance, but before opening the door, Laura stopped. Her fingers tightened on Eric's arm, and he realized she was shaking. "I told her not to worry, that he would be there the whole time." She took a deep breath, nodded and finally pushed the door open. The sound of heels echoed in the empty hallway, and each step seemed heavier than the last. When they arrived at reception, Laura asked to speak to the boss. The receptionist hesitated, but called to let him know, and minutes later he appeared. As soon as he saw them, his expression changed. The confident smile disappeared, replaced by a tension that Eric recognized immediately. He knew. I knew why they were there. The man called them into his room, trying to remain calm, but Eric noticed how he avoided looking directly at Laura. When they closed the door, he asked what was happening, but Eric took the lead and said that they knew everything, that they had proof and that they were there to resolve the situation the right way or the hard way, depending on his choice. The boss tried to deny it, but Laura interrupted, saying that she was no longer afraid and that she was ready to expose everything. She took her cell phone out of her bag and showed the recordings, throwing the weight of the evidence on the table between them. The man turned pale, tried to argue, but Eric cut him off, saying that he had already spoken to lawyers and that if he didn't cooperate, he would face not only a lawsuit, but also the complete destruction of his reputation. Laura took the moment to confront him directly, asking if he really thought he would get away with it after using the power he had to manipulate and destroy people's lives. She demanded that he resign immediately, without fanfare, and that he sign a confession acknowledging his actions to be used in the lawsuit. The man tried to resist, but Eric stood up and, with a firm stance, faced him, making it clear that they would not leave without an answer. Pressured and with no way out, the boss finally gave in. He signed the papers and asked them to leave before anyone saw what was happening. Laura took the documents with shaking hands, but as soon as they left the room, she burst into tears in Eric's arms. He held her, feeling the weight of that moment finally begin to dissolve, but he knew there was still a lot to face. In the following days, the company was covered in rumors. The boss was officially removed, and news of his dismissal spread quickly, leaving a trail of comments and speculation. Laura handed in her resignation letter soon after, determined to start over somewhere else, away from that shadow that had hung over her life for so long. She knew that, even with his departure, the marks of that period would still remain. Eric supported her in her decision, but inside, he still struggled with his own ghosts. As much as he had helped Laura to free herself from that situation, the pain of betrayal was still present, a constant reminder that not everything could be repaired so easily. They tried to move forward together, but the silent nights and avoided looks began to pile up. Eric realized that, despite all his effort, something essential had been lost between them. Laura felt that way too. In a difficult conversation, sitting at the dinner table, they finally admitted that the love they once shared had transformed into something unrecognizable. Laura said she understood if Eric wanted to move on without her, that she wouldn't blame him for wanting to leave the past behind. He held her hand, thanked her for her honesty and, with tears in her eyes, agreed that perhaps the best thing for both of them would be to start apart again. Laura moved to a small apartment, where she began to rebuild her life. He found a new job and immersed himself in work as a way to rediscover himself. She faced judgment and nasty comments, but she used this as fuel to move forward, determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Eric, on the other hand, also began to rebuild. He went back to places he liked, picked up old hobbies and, eventually, met someone new. It was a slow process and full of insecurities, but, over time, he allowed himself to love again, this time with more caution and wisdom. The boss, in turn, was not so lucky. The recordings were leaked, and he was publicly exposed, losing not only his job, but also his reputation and his family. He ended up facing legal proceedings and saw his life fall apart irreversibly. He tried to start over, but the shadow of his actions continued to haunt him, making him an example of how abuse of power and manipulation can lead to ruin. Eric and Laura followed different paths, but they carried the scars of that experience with them. They learned that trust, once broken, can hardly be repaired, and that the price of wrong choices is often higher than one imagines. In the end, they found peace in different ways, but both came out of that story transformed. If you made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. And remember, cheating is never the answer. Respect and honesty are the foundation of any healthy relationship. Until next time.